The heat came first. Alabama, June 2nd, 1943. A freight train slid to a halt beside a new sea of fence lines and wooden barracks on the edge of Aliceville. Roughly 500 prisoners, dust-coated men from the Africa Corps, stitched and bandaged from field hospitals, stepped down into a world they had only heard about in propaganda. Beyond the wire, the open country seemed endless. Boilers hissed at a water tower. A switch engine shoved a cut of flat cars stacked with crates and tractors toward a siding. American guards, young, sunburned, and more relaxed than expected, sorted the new arrivals by company and rank. The prisoners did the mental math. Fresh boards, machine cut. Rails polished by traffic. Boxcars so new their stencils shone. Whatever this place was, it could move things. They had left North Africa in layered formations, captured in the collapse around Tunis and Bizerte, staged at ports, then packed onto returning American cargo ships that would otherwise have crossed the Atlantic empty. The Liberty hull that carried them, identical to thousands of others, throbbed at a steady 11 knots through gray water, while U-boats hunted. On deck, the prisoners stared at hatch covers and winches built to a pattern. In the holds, stacked rations appeared with the regularity of a timetable. When the ship finally entered New York Harbor, or the wide roads of Virginia's Hampton Roads, the skyline, cranes, and pier sheds formed an industrial amphitheater as loud as a factory. Then the paperwork began. Numbers, fingerprints, a meal, a ferry ride to a rail yard, and east-to-west trains that seemed never to end. They had expected something else. In camp, rumor had painted America as a nation of rich civilians and soft soldiers, people of jazz, automobiles, and no stomach for hardship. What they met instead was systemized welcome and cold arithmetic. The barracks matched, the mess lines ran, and every motion slotted into a larger machine. The surprise was not kindness. Though rations shocked them, it was scale. The United States, it turned out, was a place where scale had a doctrine. They thought spirit would decide. They discovered the system decided. The hook is simple. German POWs arrived convinced that improvisation and valor beat bureaucracy. Then they watched an industrial democracy make war like a factory. Modular ships, scheduled railroads, radios on every squad net, and production lines that could outrun attrition. The system versus spirit contrast was not theory. It walked past them every day in the form of trains, pay chits, timetables, and a food line that never ran dry. The thesis of this film is that the shock many German prisoners recorded, the sense that America's power lay not only in numbers but in the plumbing that moved those numbers, came from meeting the U.S. logistics state at full throttle. 1943-1945. They learned this contrast fast because the pipeline itself was a lesson. From surrender to Camp Gate, each step ran on schedules. Troop ship conversions, embarkation terminals, receiving depots, and rail corridors. Nothing felt improvised. A prisoner might hate the destination, but he could not miss the pattern. He would see barcodes in chalk, supply officers who treated paper as ammunition, and railmen who moved him across a continent like a load of grain. On time. That was the system. It was the opposite pole to the German belief that wars were decided by operational artistry and mission-type orders. That belief had led to tactical brilliance. The American system promised something else, a math of dominance. Strategically, the timing could not have been sharper. In May 1943, the Axis position in North Africa collapsed. Allied forces sealed the Tunisian pocket and took more than 250,000 prisoners in weeks. The Africa Corps and Italian units went into cages en masse. The British Isles were already crowded with POWs, and the Atlantic traffic that took men and materiel east could not return empty. Liberty ships, 2,710 built by 1945, a convoy of clones, began carrying prisoners west. The decision to house them in the United States solved three problems with one voyage. It freed Allied base space, filled deadhead crossings, and supplied American farms and canneries with wartime labor. That decision mattered because the U.S. home front in 1943-44 was a single organism made up of shipyards, railroads, depots, and fields, and it was short of hands. As millions of Americans shipped out, the War Manpower Commission and the Office of the Provost Marshal General coordinated POW work details under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Camps appeared inland, often in the South and Midwest, near crops and factories. At the peak in May 1945, about 683 Germans were held, part of roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners on U.S. soil. From roughly 155 toward 175 base camps, a web of 511 branch camps pushed labor out to farms, sawmills, and canneries. The prisoners were paid token, wages, about 80 cents per workday, and camp canteens, stocked goods that would stun men who had starved on the retreat through Tunisia. If the war in Europe would be decided by output and delivery, bombers, tanks, fuel, and food, then bringing POWs to the source of that output was more than a convenience. It became a quiet campaign in perception. Every train ride and work detail was a seminar in what an industrial federation could do. On the opponent's side, assumptions were not baseless. German doctrine had real teeth. Off-Trag's tactic, mission-type command, prized initiative down to the company level. The Wehrmacht's small unit training was rugged, and veterans from North Africa had watched American units break at Kasserine before regrouping. Many prisoners carried a mental model of the United States as a materialist giant. Technically impressive, maybe, but weak in will, a country of machines and money, as Camp Talk framed it. They believed war was won by operational art, by the spirit that made a battalion commander turn indecision into movement. If America relied on quantity, the German belief ran, the Germans could outthink them at the point of contact. There were reasons those assumptions sounded logical. The German army had dominated continental operations with fast, flexible combined arms. It had calibrated fire and maneuver at scales Americans were still learning in 1942, early 1943. Radios in German formations had once been an edge. American units were new to the desert and the hedgerow, and propaganda amplified all of it, building a picture of Americans as soft consumers with uneven units and no historic appetite for long campaigns. That picture would fail, but only after prisoners saw what the American state could do with schedules, material controls, and a radio on every platoon net. The American design philosophy rested on three pillars: standardize, schedule, and saturate. At sea, the United States mass-produced hulls. The Liberty ship was not beautiful, but it was the definition of good enough. A 10,000-ton cargo battery that could be welded fast and sailed by reservists. 2,710 of them slid down ways between 1941 and 1945. The speed record, SS Robert E. Peary, went from keel to launch in 4 days and 15 hours in a shipyard race that itself felt like a propaganda film. Victory ships followed, faster and longer-legged. In the air, output was a weapon. American factories delivered around 270 aircraft in 1944 alone, and roughly 300,000 for the war. The Ford Willow Run plant, designed like a city under one roof, delivered 8,685 B-24 Liberators with late 1944 throughput around 650 per month. On some shifts, the line produced one heavy bomber every 50 to 60-odd minutes. Those numbers were not mere trivia. They were the calendar that scheduled bombing campaigns, trained air crews, and filled boneyards with spares. On the ground, radios and railroads did the unromantic work. The SCR-300 backpack set, clumsy by today's standards, around 32 to 38 pounds with battery, gave company-level FM voice out to a few miles, knitting infantry and tanks into a more responsive whole. Meanwhile, railroads carried the country on steel. Freight surged to roughly 737 billion ton-miles in 1944, a wartime record. Passengers packed coaches, too. Troop trains rewrote schedules. The system ran hot, and it did not apologize. When POWs arrived, they stepped into that philosophy. The office of the Provost Marshal General built camps to a pattern. The War Production Board allocated steel, aluminum, and labor by formula. The Transportation Corps timed ferries and switching moves to clear piers. Every paperwork stamp and chow bell was logistics wearing a human face. First contact, tactically, was a ship and a pier. A typical group captured in Tunisia boarded a Liberty hull at an Algerian or Moroccan port. The crossing took roughly 2 weeks, longer if convoy routing zigzagged for submarines. Meals were regular, inspections strict, and boredom thick. When the convoy threaded into New York, prisoners glimpsed the forest of masts and cranes, then moved off the ship in file for processing. Fingerprints, serials, a quick medical glance, and a hot meal. Some went by harbor ferry to a Pennsylvania railroad yard in Jersey City, then boarded coaches or boxcars outfitted with benches for the long ride inland. Others disembarked at Virginia's Hampton Roads port of embarkation, where a similar machine sorted them. The contrast with the desert was cruel. No shrapnel, no sandstorms, just order. In Alabama, at Aliceville, the new arrivals found 400 wood-frame barracks, kitchens, showers, hospital wards, and a camp the Army expanded into a segregation camp by 1944 to isolate ardent Nazis after a string of intimidation beatings in the POW system. The headcount here ran to thousands. Across the Southeast, the numbers rose into the tens of thousands. Prisoners measured the place by small signs. A bakery that worked like a clock. A mess hall whose line never ran out. A camp motor pool with spares for every truck. Shock took a gentler form at the chow line. Under the Geneva Convention, rations had to be comparable to U.S. troops. A man who had eaten thin soup in a retreat now cradled a tray with meat, potatoes, bread, and coffee. The canteen stocked cigarettes, soap, and sometimes Coca-Cola. Unthinkable back home in 1943. The camp library and classes opened later, followed by work details that paid 80 cents per day in scrip. The psychological message landed without any schooling. In this country, abundance was process, not an exception. The immediate outcome of first contact was not conversion. It was silence. Men talked less boldly on the bunks. The most committed insisted this was a facade, a show for prisoners. The turning point was not a single battle. It was a drumbeat of set pieces that taught the same lesson. Louder. One was the harvest. In the summer and fall of 1944, branch camps sent POWs to farms from Kansas to Wisconsin. Camp Concordia, Kansas, one of the largest, fed work details into fields and canneries. The prisoners looked up from pea vines and saw the supply chain. Tractors where horses had been, combines pulling grain in wide swaths, canneries stoking boilers around the clock. Boxcars moved like clock hands. The elevator at the edge of town filled and emptied on a schedule as impersonal as gravity. For men raised on the German ideal of artisanal thoroughness, the American credo, good enough on time, at scale, registered as a different kind of excellence. Another set piece lived in the newspapers and rumor mill, Willow Run. Even without visiting Michigan, prisoners heard about the plant that built B-24s like cars, 8,685 total, roughly 650 per month by late 1944, a bomber an hour at peak tempo. Every number connected to a site. Triangle-tailed silhouettes overhead in formation, flat cars drifting past with nacelles under canvas, trucks piled with crates stamped with part numbers. The plant's existence made the sky feel crowded. It also changed the POW mental map. If one factory could do that with a four-engine bomber, what could thousands of factories do with trucks, radios, and ammunition? A third set piece was the railroad itself. By 1944, U.S. railways hauled on the order of 783 billion ton-miles of freight and moved roughly all the troop mass of an army in motion. The trains prisoners rode were small tributaries to a river that ran day and night. When men from North Africa watched a manifest freight of 50 cars take a siding so a troop train could pass, they saw not a vignette, but a policy. Priority flows, dispatching doctrine, and labor sufficient to keep locomotives hot and bearings oiled. The math of dominance was not poetry. It was dispatch sheets. The cause-effect chain ran from policy to perception. The Controlled Materials Plan at the War Production Board rationed steel and copper. The Transportation Corps rationed tonnage. The OPMG rationed labor. The Army Signal Corps rationed radios and batteries. Each decision moved something in a loop that took a prisoner from pier to harvest and back again, with a payday on the way. When the loop closed, the prisoner's talk hardened into arithmetic. He might hate it. He could not deny it. Behind the set, Pieces was a system that manufactured victory by manufacturing the ability to make victory. Supply. The U.S. shifted a consumer economy onto war rails without knifing its core plumbing. The Controlled Materials Plan segmented demand and kept bottlenecks from starving priority programs. In 1944, ingot steel output edged past 1943 despite fewer workers. Productivity rose as the system burned off inefficiencies. Maintenance, standardization slashed downtime. Liberty ships used repeatable plant routines. Army motor pools stocked parts for common truck families. The Air Forces fielded a pyramid of depot and sub-depot shops to keep B-24s and P-51s flying. The result was availability. Not perfect, never tidy, but persistent. Training pipeline. Abundance scaled into instruction. The Army Air Forces cycled tens of thousands of aircrew through a ladder of primary, basic, and advanced schools. Training hours for U.S. pilots remained high, even as combat operations surged. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilot hours had collapsed to near the minimum needed to fly straight and level. American hours stayed robust. That differential fed attrition curves ruthless in their implication. Administration. The OPMG ran a national camp network like a franchise. The camp at Aliceville did not improvise its payroll. Concordia did not guess its medical forms. Every tie-down, leave policy for guards, disciplinary logs, segregation procedures, ran to template. The system emitted predictability. Prisoners learned to mark their days by it. Control and intelligence did their part. At the tactical edge, sets like the SCR-300 carried company-level FM orders. Heavy, yes, but a revolution in field nets. At higher echelons, the United States stitched together port records, railroad dispatches, and depot inventories to know what it had and where it was. Even in the background, the re-education effort, centered at Fort Kearny's Special Projects Division, pushed newspapers and programming into camps, testing whether information and lived experience would do more than lectures ever could. Strategic intelligence mattered, too. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, after the fact, would document the industrial geography of the war as if it were a map of arteries and veins. Oil and transport nodes were not abstractions. They were lists of targets, and later, lists of photographs of empty rail yards and refineries with no output. Prisoners could not see those reports, but they saw the effect. A sky full of aircraft and trains that never ran out of coal. The human capital gap was not just about how many people. It was about how many hours per person and how well a crew practiced together. American aircrew training, for example, ran a long syllabus with live-fire gunnery and night work. While numbers vary, a conservative comparison holds. By late 1944, U.S. fighter pilots often had several hundred hours before combat, while many late-war German pilots had a fraction of that, sometimes roughly 100 or less, due to fuel shortages and the collapse of the training pipeline. In a sky with massed formations and radar-guided fighters, that gap converted into kill ratios. On the ground, American tank and infantry crews drilled coordination with radios that, though imperfect, were available and supported. In contrast, German units in late 1944 increasingly faced fuel rationing, shorter training cycles, and replacement flows that slotted individuals, not intact teams, into combat. For POWs working in canneries, the human capital gap looked like something else. A workforce of women and older men who ran machinery at tempo while their sons and husbands were overseas. The line speeds were real. The quality control was repeatable. A prisoner who had grown up in pre-war artisanal shops watched a teenager in a hairscarf manage a pressure retort with a checklist and a watch. The culture shock was almost as sharp as the industrial shock. Even pay routines made a point. 80 cents per day for labor was not wealth, but it bought soap and coffee at a camp canteen and funded small comforts. The bill of fare, regular and unexciting, contrasted with rationing back home and with thin Wehrmacht field kitchens in retreat. The difference was systematic, not theatrical. Tactically, the United States steadily refused the kind of knife fight the enemy preferred. On land, the doctrine that matured from 1943 onward stressed combined arms at measured tempo, heavy artillery preparation, and logistics-paced operations. If the German ideal was a bold maneuver that cracked a seam, the American answer was to thicken the seam with steel, fire, and replacements until it no longer mattered. At sea, convoy systems and air cover made individual U-boat hunts into a numbers game the Allies could win. In the air, the U.S. pushed for massed strikes and attrition that favored replacement pools and factory throughput. POWs who expected a duel of aces watched a duel of capacities. That refusal to fight on the enemy's terms showed up even in camp operations. When pro-Nazi elements tried to enforce underground discipline on fellow prisoners, the American response was not romantic. It was bureaucratic isolation, segregation camps, new billets, and court-martials when murders occurred. The rhetoric of camp life grew quieter as the system removed the loudest men from the population. Nuance matters. The American system did not impress everyone, everywhere, always. Some prisoners dismissed it as wasteful, big, loud, and imprecise. Others were unmoved by abundance, focused instead on humiliation or homesickness. Not every camp day was orderly. Not every guard was humane. There were murders of anti-Nazi prisoners by fellow inmates in several camps, the most notorious leading to U.S. trials and hangings at Fort Leavenworth. There were escape attempts. The Papago Park Tunnel made headlines. And there were American lapses in camp management. And while stories of POWs marveling at ice cream and supermarkets circulate, sourcing can be soft. Many accounts are oral histories decades after the fact. The broader point stands on better ground. Prisoners repeatedly encountered a level of material, organization, and throughput that contrasted sharply with late war Germany. Now the numbers roll up. The math of dominance in a conservative key. POWs in the U.S. Approximately 371,683 Germans at peak in May 1945, within about 425,000 Axis prisoners total. Camps, around 155 IDUs 175. Main camps, 511 branch camps. TSHA, Wyoming Wikipedia list. Monthly arrivals in late 1944. Often 30,000 via New York and Hampton roads. Early 1945, flows ran higher. TSHA, Virginia State Sources. Liberty ships, 2,710 built. 1941-45. Record build Robert E. Peary, Fort Hay, 15 Cho. Average build times dropped to weeks. NPS USNI Wikipedia. U.S. aircraft, 96 Su-70 in 1944, 300,000 wartime total. Peak month March, 1944, 9,000. AF Statistical Digest, Air and Space. Willow Run B-24s, 8,006 ton. 185 total. 650s month late 1944, 1 per 63 minutes at peak tempo. 3.5 million square feet under roof. The Henry Ford. Detroit Historical. Rail freight, 737, 783 billion ton miles in 1944. Troop passenger miles near 95 billion same year. Our Utah, secondary syntheses. Steel. Ingot steel output in 1944 slightly exceeded 1943 by 1 million tons, 89 said a 90 million short tons. WPB 1944 annual. POW labor, 0.80 POWs a day, deployed heavily to agriculture in 1944-45. Texas beyond history. Individually, none of these figures is a silver bullet. Together, they describe a production function that solved for time. The U.S. could afford to take tactical setbacks and still accelerate the war's mean curve. It could lose ships and replace them. It could lose aircraft and surge replacements. It could move harvests, push training classes, and pay prisoners because the plumbing worked. The psychological collapse, when it came, reached from the front lines back into the barbed wire. Diaries and interviews often capture the same theme. Not adoration for America, but a steady unraveling of certainty. Men who had believed that willpower would beat factories began to doubt. Some shifted loyalties. Others simply went quiet. The camp newspapers and radio hours were one vector. The lived reality of order was another. The murders of suspected informers by pro-Nazi prisoners, Johannes Kunze at Tonkawa, the lynching of Werner Drexler after his cooperation with U.S. intelligence, show that belief did not melt everywhere. But the trend inside the wire matched the trend outside. The field for ideology narrowed as the calendar advanced. The math was against them. Operationally, the POW program also had second-order effects. Work details stabilized farm output in regions short of labor. Canneries hit production goals that fed troops overseas and cities at home. Ports kept flowing because laundry rooms and kitchens had help. The presence of POWs at the margins kept the center moving. This was not decisive alone. It was additive, and wartime success was a sum of additions. In the next 3 to 12 months, the momentum turned into outcomes. By late 1944 and into 1945, U.S. aircraft filled the sky in numbers Germany could not match. Oil campaigns throttled fuel. Rail yards in Europe choked, then stilled. At home, Willow Run tapered only when demand shifted. The Army Air Force's Statistical Digest tallied outputs and losses with a cold pen. POW arrivals peaked as German armies crumpled. In May 1945, the POW headcount in the U.S. crested. Repatriation then began, a reverse pipeline from camps to ports to ships to Europe, run with the same administrative energy that had brought them over. Within a year, many of the men who had stared at American freight yards were back in a wrecked Germany. Some carried new doubts. Others carried a quiet respect for a machine that had not broken. In American towns that had hosted camps, Aliceville, Concordia, local memory would organize reunions decades later. The barbed wire was long gone. The economy that had built it was not. The old chimney at Aliceville still stands as a stub of stone, a strangely gentle marker for a time when numbers ran the world. The United States generally complied with the 1929 Geneva Convention. Housing comparable to U.S. troops, medical care, pay for labor, Red Cross access, religious services, and repatriation rules. But compliance is not a halo. Pro-Nazi prisoners terrorized and sometimes murdered anti-Nazi inmates. U.S. authorities responded with segregation camps and prosecutions, culminating in executions at Fort Leavenworth. Some camp staff failed prisoners. Some prisoners abused privileges. And work was not freely chosen. It was compelled within the convention's framework. Any humane accounting of this program must hold two facts at once. Treatment was materially better than in many other theaters, and coercion and intra-camp violence were real. Legacy sits at the junction of doctrine and memory. Post-war U.S. doctrine doubled down on what had worked. Standardization, decentralized radio nets, mass training pipelines, and industrial mobilization plans that could be taken off the shelf. The Air Force formalized its statistical habits. The Transportation Corps kept its playbooks. The War Production Board's lessons about bottlenecks lived on in Defense Production Act thinking. The German side's post-war debates wrestled with a different conclusion. Tactical excellence cannot overcome a superior production logistics system operated by a polity with deep reserves. Some former POWs played roles in Germany's reconstruction. Re-education materials seeded ideas later seen in Der Ruf and other publications. The cultural residue, skepticism toward romantic militarism, owes something to men who saw how a democracy fights with checklists. Training reforms across NATO in the 1950s quietly reflect the wartime arithmetic. Radio discipline, logistics planning, and maintenance culture became core. The lesson was not that spirit doesn't matter. It was that spirit without a system is a speech. The winning side had both. Return to the train at Aliceville. The first June heat still bakes the ballast. On that day in 1943, the arriving prisoners did not know the names of Willow Run or the Controlled Materials Plan. They only knew what they could see. Cars loaded to the roof, barracks in rows that snapped to a grid, guards who looked like kids but carried clipboards with checklists. Those clipboards were the tell. In the United States, the war was a problem that could be put on paper and solved with tonnage, hours, and parts lists. The men who walked under the watchtowers learned that hard truth. In the end, the American system did not outshout the German spirit. It outlasted it, like a freight train that keeps its schedule no matter the weather, because someone, somewhere, counted every mile. Aliceville setting, rail metaphor supported by AAR ton-mile data.